Murder of a Mozambican taxi driver.
Dragged and killed Mozambican taxi driver Emidio Macia.
Macia's legs when the dragging incident began.
We immediately suspend all policemen that were involved in the incident.
Around 1,000 people die in South Africa every year in police custody.
On a quiet Tuesday morning in February 2013, the streets of Daveyton, a township in Gauteng, South Africa, would witness something so shocking that it would spark international outrage and forever change how the world viewed police brutality in post-apartheid South Africa. What started as a routine traffic stop would end in tragedy, exposing the dark underbelly of power, corruption, and systemic violence that still plagued the nation nearly 2 decades after democracy. The events of that morning would be captured on video by horrified bystanders, creating evidence so damning that it could not be ignored or covered up like so many other cases of police brutality. Viewer discretion is advised as this video contains discussions of police violence and death. The story you are about to hear involves real people, real trauma, and a family that lost their son in the most horrific circumstances imaginable. 27-year-old Emidio Mido Macia was living what many would consider a modest but hopeful life. Originally from Mozambique, Mido had crossed the border into South Africa like thousands of other young African men, seeking better opportunities and a chance to build something meaningful for himself and his family back home. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't famous, and he certainly wasn't looking for trouble. Mido worked as a taxi driver in Daveyton, a job that put food on his table and allowed him to send money back home to his family in Mozambique. It was honest work in a country where opportunities for foreign nationals were often limited and fraught with challenges. Those who knew Mido described him as quiet, hardworking, and respectful. He spoke Portuguese and broken English, navigating life in a country where xenophobia against foreign nationals was, unfortunately, common and sometimes violent. Like many immigrants, Mido kept his head down, worked hard, and tried to stay out of trouble. He understood that as a foreign national, he was vulnerable in ways that South African citizens weren't. Every interaction with authority carried additional risk, and he was acutely aware that his accent, his documentation status, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time could make him a target for discrimination or worse. The relationship between foreign nationals and South African police had always been complicated and often hostile. In the years leading up to 2013, tensions were running particularly high throughout the country. Xenophobic attacks had rocked South Africa in 2008, leaving dozens dead and thousands displaced from their homes. Foreign nationals, particularly those from other African countries like Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Somalia, often faced discrimination, harassment, and violence from both civilians and law enforcement. Many lived in constant fear, knowing that they were seen as outsiders, as competition for jobs, as easy targets for both criminals and corrupt officials who knew they had limited recourse. Mido was acutely aware of these harsh realities. Friends and fellow taxi drivers later said he was always careful around police, always polite, always compliant with any requests or demands. He carried his documentation religiously, followed traffic rules to the letter, and avoided confrontation at all costs. He had learned, like so many other foreign nationals, that survival often depended on making yourself as invisible as possible to those in power. February 26, 2013 started like any other day for him. He woke up, prepared for another day of work, and had no way of knowing that a routine encounter with police officers would spiral completely out of control and end his life. The South African Police Service in 2013 was an institution in crisis, struggling with a legacy of brutality and corruption that stretched back decades. Despite the end of apartheid in 1994 and numerous promises of reform, many officers still carried the brutal mentalities and tactics of the old regime. Training was often inadequate. Corruption was rampant throughout many stations, and accountability was virtually non-existent. Police brutality cases were regularly swept under the rug, and officers rarely faced serious consequences for their actions, no matter how severe. This culture of impunity created an environment where some officers believed they could act with absolute authority and violence, especially when dealing with vulnerable populations like foreign nationals, the poor, and those without political connections. What makes Mido's case particularly heartbreaking and infuriating is how completely preventable it was. This wasn't a high-stakes criminal investigation, a dangerous armed robbery in progress, or a violent crime scene that required immediate action. This was allegedly nothing more than a routine traffic stop that should have lasted a few minutes at most, resulted in perhaps a fine or warning, and allowed everyone involved to continue with their day. But on that Tuesday morning in Daveyton, 8 South African police officers would make decisions that would shock the world and expose the rot within their institution for all to see. The morning was typical for Daveyton, with people heading to work, children walking to school, vendors setting up their stalls, and the usual hustle and bustle of a township life beginning another day. Mido was allegedly driving his vehicle through the area when he was pulled over by police officers who later claimed this was a routine traffic stop for a minor violation. According to initial police reports, this was supposedly nothing more than standard procedure, but what witnesses would later describe, and what video evidence would eventually reveal to a horrified world, painted a very different and far more sinister picture of how this encounter actually unfolded and escalated beyond all reason. As we'll discover in the next part of this story, the officers allegedly involved in Mido's arrest had a troubling history of aggressive behavior and questionable conduct that should have raised red flags with their superiors. Some had previous complaints filed against them by community members. Others had been involved in similar incidents that had been covered up or ignored by their commanding officers. The culture of impunity that protected bad actors within the police service, that allowed violent officers to continue working without consequences, was about to be exposed in the most public and horrific way imaginable, broadcast to the world through the power of cell phone cameras and social media. What do you think about police accountability in cases like these? How should foreign nationals be protected from abuse by those sworn to serve and protect? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, but remember that we're dealing with a real family's tragedy here, so please keep the discussion respectful and constructive. February 26, 2013, approximately 7:30 a.m. Daveyton Township was coming alive with the sounds and sights of another weekday morning, with commuters heading to work and the daily rhythm of life beginning once again. Emidio Macia was allegedly driving through the area when he encountered the South African Police Service officers who would change everything in the most horrific way possible. According to initial police statements that would later be heavily scrutinized and challenged, this was described as a routine traffic violation stop, the kind that happens thousands of times every day across the country. But witness accounts and video evidence that would emerge would later tell a completely different and far more disturbing story about what actually happened during those fatal morning hours. The officers allegedly involved included members of the Daveyton police station, whose names would later become synonymous with one of South Africa's most shocking police brutality cases. 8 men who had sworn an oath to serve and protect their community were about to allegedly participate in something that would horrify the world and bring international condemnation down upon their country. These were not rookie officers fresh out of training, but experienced policemen who should have known better, who should have understood both the law and basic human decency. According to witness testimony that would later be heard in court, Mido was allegedly pulled from his vehicle and handcuffed during what should have been a simple interaction between citizen and police. What should have been a routine exchange of documents, perhaps the issuance of a citation or warning, quickly escalated in ways that defied all logic and training. Police would later allege that Mido was resisting arrest and being uncooperative, but witnesses painted a very different picture of the encounter. They described a man who was confused and frightened, trying desperately to communicate in broken English, while officers became increasingly aggressive and hostile toward him for reasons that were never adequately explained. Here's where the story takes a turn that still shocks people around the world today, more than a decade later. At approximately 7:45 a.m., according to multiple witness accounts and video evidence that would later surface and spread across the globe, the officers allegedly decided to use their police van in a way that no training manual has ever prescribed or authorized. They allegedly attached Mido to the back of their moving vehicle while he was still handcuffed, unable to protect himself, unable to break free, completely helpless and at their mercy. What happened next would be captured on cell phone cameras by horrified bystanders who could not believe what they were witnessing. The footage that emerged would become some of the most disturbing evidence of police misconduct ever captured, and it would ensure that Mido's death could not be covered up or forgotten. The footage that emerged would become some of the most disturbing evidence of police brutality ever captured on camera in South Africa's democratic era. Multiple bystanders used their mobile phones to record what happened next, creating evidence that would prove crucial in the eventual prosecution of the officers involved. The video allegedly shows a man being dragged behind a police van for approximately 500 meters while handcuffed, unable to break free, unable to protect himself, completely at the mercy of officers who had allegedly lost all sense of humanity and professional responsibility. Witnesses described hearing Mido allegedly crying out in Portuguese and English, pleading for help, begging the officers to stop what they were doing to him. The van allegedly traveled approximately 500 meters with Mido being dragged behind it across the rough asphalt surface of the township streets. People on the street were shouting at the officers to stop. Horrified community members were trying to intervene and get the attention of the police, but according to witness testimony that would later be heard in court, the officers allegedly continued driving, seemingly oblivious to or uncaring about the pleas for mercy from both their victim and the crowd that had gathered. The scene was described as absolutely horrific by those who saw it unfold. Witnesses later testified that they had never seen anything like it, that it was like watching a nightmare come to life in broad daylight on the streets of their own community. Some people were crying, others were shouting, many were recording on their phones, but everyone was united in their shock and horror at what they were witnessing. This was not law enforcement. This was not proper police procedure. This was something else entirely, something that belonged in the darkest chapters of South Africa's apartheid past, not in the democratic present. At approximately 8 a.m., the van finally stopped. Mido was allegedly found unconscious and severely injured, his body bearing the horrific evidence of what had been done to him. Instead of immediately calling for medical assistance, which should have been the first priority of any reasonable person in that situation, police reports suggest the officers placed him in the back of the van and transported him to the Daveyton police station. This decision would prove crucial to understanding the officers' alleged mindset and their apparent attempt to control the narrative of what had happened, to somehow manage the situation before it spiraled completely out of their control. By the time medical personnel were finally called and arrived on the scene, Mido's condition was already critical. He was rushed to Tambo Memorial Hospital where doctors and nurses worked desperately to save his life, but the injuries he had allegedly sustained during the dragging incident were simply too severe for medical intervention to be successful. According to medical reports that would later be presented in court, Mido had suffered extensive injuries consistent with being dragged across asphalt while unable to protect himself. Injuries that were described by medical professionals as horrific and ultimately fatal. At approximately 10:30 a.m., less than 3 hours after what should have been a routine traffic stop, Emidio Mido Macia was pronounced dead at Tambo Memorial Hospital. Medical reports indicated he had suffered extensive injuries consistent with being dragged across asphalt while unable to protect himself. A young man who had left Mozambique seeking a better life, who worked honestly as a taxi driver, who sent money home to his family, was gone. The hospital staff who treated him later described the extent of his injuries as horrific and said they had rarely seen trauma of that severity from any cause. The footage exploded online, and within hours the world was watching how South Africa would respond to this alleged act of police brutality. South Africans were horrified by what they saw, but the reaction went far beyond the country's borders. The images of a man allegedly being dragged behind a police van while handcuffed struck at the heart of the country's painful history with police brutality and forced uncomfortable questions about how much had really changed since the end of apartheid. This wasn't happening in some distant authoritarian country. This was happening in South Africa, in the rainbow nation that was supposed to be a beacon of human rights and democracy for the continent and the world. The alleged motive behind the officers' actions remains shocking in its complete banality and senselessness. According to police statements and witness accounts that would later be scrutinized in court, this entire tragedy allegedly began over nothing more than a minor traffic violation, the kind of everyday infraction that millions of drivers commit without thinking twice about it. There was no high-speed chase, no weapons involved, no violent crime in progress, no threat to public safety. Mido was allegedly guilty of nothing more than a routine traffic infraction. Yet 8 officers would soon be facing the most serious charges in the South African legal system. What the video evidence suggested was a complete breakdown of police training, human decency, and basic respect for human life. The officers allegedly continued their actions despite witnesses begging them to stop, despite having multiple opportunities to de-escalate the situation, and despite Mido's alleged pleas for mercy. This wasn't a split-second decision made in the heat of a dangerous confrontation. This was a sustained action that continued for several minutes while bystanders pleaded for it to stop. The community of Daveyton was left in shock, struggling to understand how something so brutal could happen in broad daylight on their streets, captured on video for the whole world to see. Within hours of Mido's death, the video footage had spread beyond Daveyton, beyond Gauteng, beyond South Africa's borders, becoming a viral sensation for all the wrong reasons. International media outlets and human rights groups condemned the killing, and suddenly the world was watching how South Africa would respond to this alleged act of police brutality. The pressure for swift justice was immense, but those familiar with the South African justice system knew that police accountability cases often dragged on for years without resolution, with officers frequently escaping serious consequences for their actions. The Independent Police Investigative Directorate, known as IPID, took over the investigation immediately, recognizing that this was exactly the type of high-profile case that the civilian oversight body had been created to handle. The video evidence was clear and damning. The victim was dead, and 8 officers were allegedly involved in actions that had led to his death. It seemed like it should be an open and shut case, but South Africa's troubling history with police prosecution suggested that nothing could be taken for granted, regardless of how strong the evidence appeared to be. After Mido's death, the Independent Police Investigative Directorate opened a probe, and the officers were arrested and remanded. The handling of their hearings and the pace of the justice process inflamed public anger, and raised urgent questions about police accountability throughout the country. The relatively slow movement of the case through the courts, despite clear video evidence of what had allegedly occurred, sparked further outrage in communities already angry about police impunity and the lack of consequences for officers who abused their power. This situation highlighted everything that was wrong with how police brutality cases were typically handled in South Africa's justice system. Here were 8 officers allegedly caught on video participating in actions that led to a man's death. Yet the legal process seemed to move at a glacial pace while communities demanded swift justice. The message this sent to vulnerable populations, particularly foreign nationals and marginalized groups who already lived in fear of police abuse, was devastating and demoralizing. Meanwhile, Mido's family in Mozambique was struggling to understand what had happened to their beloved son and brother, dealing with language barriers, complex legal procedures, and the logistics of repatriating his body for burial. The family was largely dependent on others to advocate for justice on their behalf, including local civil rights groups and the Mozambican consulate, who worked tirelessly to ensure the family's voices were heard throughout the lengthy legal proceedings that would follow. The funeral arrangements became a powerful focal point for community grief, anger, and solidarity. When Mido's body was finally released for burial, hundreds of people attended his funeral service, including many who had never met him, but were united in their outrage over how he had died. The ceremony was conducted in both Portuguese and English, recognizing his identity as a Mozambican who had made South Africa his home and his workplace. Community leaders spoke movingly about how his death represented the vulnerability that all foreign nationals faced in South Africa, and how his case had become a symbol of the need for fundamental reform in policing and justice. The legal proceedings would drag on for more than 2 years, as is unfortunately typical in the South African justice system, where cases often move slowly through overcrowded courts. Throughout most of this period, the officers remained free while the case made its way through the legal system, a situation that continued to infuriate communities who saw it as another example of police officers receiving preferential treatment, even when accused of the most serious crimes possible under South African law. On 25 August 2015, the North Gauteng High Court found the 8 officers guilty of murder. Later that year, the court sentenced each of them to 15 years imprisonment. The convictions were significant and represented a rare occurrence in police brutality cases where officers were actually held accountable for their actions and received substantial sentences for their crimes. The murder convictions, rather than lesser charges, sent a strong message that the courts would not tolerate this level of police brutality, even from sworn officers. The community reaction to the verdict was mixed, but generally positive. While many people were relieved that the officers had finally been held accountable, which was genuinely rare in police brutality cases, others felt that even 15 years wasn't sufficient given the horrific nature of their actions and the international embarrassment they had caused their country. However, the fact that they were convicted of murder rather than a lesser charge was seen as a significant victory for justice and a sign that the legal system was capable of holding police officers accountable when the evidence was overwhelming and the public pressure was sustained. What single reform would you put in place to prevent this happening again? Comment below, but please keep the discussion respectful, as we're talking about a real person's life and a family that is still dealing with this tragedy. Your thoughtful input could contribute to meaningful discussions about police reform and accountability. Mido Macia's case forced South Africa to confront uncomfortable truths about police brutality, xenophobia, systemic racism, and accountability that many people would have preferred to ignore. The fact that this incident was captured on video meant it couldn't be covered up, denied, or forgotten, like so many other cases of police abuse that happen without witnesses or documentation. It sparked important and necessary conversations about police training, civilian oversight, the treatment of foreign nationals, and the deep reforms needed within South African law enforcement. Today, nearly a decade later, Mido's case remains a stark and painful reminder of how quickly routine interactions can turn deadly when power is abused and when officers forget their oath to serve and protect. His death highlighted the urgent need for systemic reform in how police are trained, supervised, held accountable for their actions, and the importance of strong civilian oversight to prevent such tragedies from occurring again. While the officers were ultimately convicted and sentenced, the case also demonstrated how even clear video evidence doesn't guarantee swift justice, and how the legal system can move painfully, slowly, even in the most clear-cut cases. The broader implications of this case extend far beyond South Africa's borders and resonate with communities around the world who have experienced similar injustices at the hands of those sworn to protect them. In an era where police brutality has become a global concern, where cell phone cameras and social media have made it impossible to hide abuse, Mido's story resonates with people everywhere who have seen similar cases in their own countries. His death became a symbol of the vulnerability that marginalized communities face when those sworn to protect them become their oppressors, and the importance of citizen journalism in exposing abuse that might otherwise be covered up. If this case has affected you emotionally, or made you think more deeply about police accountability in your own community, consider supporting organizations that advocate for justice, police reform, and the rights of immigrants and marginalized communities. Remember to subscribe for more true crime content that examines important social justice issues, and let me know in the comments what cases you'd like me to cover next. Most importantly, let's not forget Emidio Mido Macia, a young man whose life was cut tragically short, whose death sparked international outrage and important conversations about justice, and whose memory continues to inspire calls for meaningful reform in policing and accountability around the world.